Today, four of us will be present, will present the information. We have a lot of others at ECT that are monitoring and influencing the process, but we think the three major speakers can best condense an awful lot of information into a manageable size. Each will present a little introduction when they speak, but overall, Jude is going to present the nuts and bolts of the Restore Act. Lee Smith is going to explain how to identify good projects and then shoehorn them into the current requirements, even as those requirements evolve. Marty is going to walk you through an example project and suggest some things that would differentiate your project from others in a way that increases the likelihood of gaining funding. And I will try to provide some insight on how best to navigate the ever-changing process. Next slide. You probably are asking yourself, why ECT? Well, first, ECT is a Florida-based company with decades of experience in ecosystem restoration. We have 19 offices with 7 in Florida. We also have decades of experience of harvesting federal ecosystem funding for our clients. We didn't intend to become grant experts. It happened because our clients weren't getting their fair share, and we wanted to help. 20 years ago, we advocated for 30 communities in a particular watershed, which resulted in nearly $300 million of restoration funding over the following 20 years. And they are still our clients. When George Bush and subsequently Barack Obama began to advocate for the restoration of the Great Lakes, we worked with congressional representatives, the EPA, the state regulators, and the local communities to initiate and implement the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Our community clients have benefited with awards totaling nearly $100 million and counting. We tell you these things only to stress that we have seen federal government implement major restoration efforts. This is why we know the rules will change as they go along. We believe that some of the decisions will be similar to the past decisions, and we want our clients to be prepared as these decisions are being made. So, as things change, we will continue to share what we know with our clients. At the end of this presentation will be the Restore Act info website, Facebook, Twitter, and email address. Even better, feel free to give us a call. We'll be glad to share what we know and tell all that we know. So today's talk will help you decide how to define your project such that it puts your best foot forward. It will require that you know the rules, not only when you're competing for funding, but when the funding is awarded, and yes, as the project is being closed out and being audited. And once again, if ECT's experience is any measure, rules, selection process, priorities are likely to change. Our advice, stay informed. Jude?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining ECT today in our discussion about the Restore Act and the opportunities it presents to the Gulf Coast and, in particular, here in Florida. I'm Jude Dawson, based out of ECT's Gainesville office, and as a lifelong Florida resident, I have a personal deep-rooted interest in the protection and restoration of our coastlines and natural resources. I've been watching the development of the Restore Act, and it's important to me that we do what we can to make sure that those funds get to the communities where they'll have the most impact. The resources and ecosystem sustainability, tourist opportunities, and revived economies of the Gulf Coast States Act of 2012 was signed into law on July 6th of last year, the Restore Act. It established the creation of the Gulf Coast Restoration Trust Fund for the civil penalties resulting from the BP oil spill. It will divert 80% of any civil and administrative Clean Water Act penalties collected as a result of the Deepwater Horizon incident for ecological and economic restoration. The Restore Act lays out the basic framework for 3 main funding mechanisms to distribute those funds to the affected areas. The details of administering those funds are still being defined. But first, for a bit of context, I want to take a half step back and differentiate just a little bit between the Restore Act and the Natural Resources Damage Assessment under the Oil Pollution Control Act. These are distinctly different funding streams administered both by different agencies with different purposes and requirements. And while they're both underfunded by the BP civil penalties, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment, or NRDA payments, are directly tied to environmental damages and are administered by federal agencies. The compensation received through NRDA is limited to covering the costs of the assessment and to recovering the natural resources that were harmed back to pre-spill conditions. So if it's broken, they have to fix it. The responsible parties are only required to fix what was injured by the spill, nothing more. And in contrast to that, the Restore Act, in recognizing the need to recover from and repair the damages from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, establishes a mechanism for long-term recovery of the impacted ecosystems in the 5 Gulf Coast states that were affected by the spill. The Restore Act directs that 4/5 of the penalty money be divided up between the 5 Gulf Coast states and to be spent largely outside of federal control. The intended result is a quicker distribution to the affected areas, more leeway, and public input mostly into what those funds can be spent on, for instance, economic restoration projects. So what does the Restore Act do? It establishes the creation of the Gulf Coast Restoration Trust Fund for the civil penalties resulting from the BP oil spill, and it provides a general framework for the distribution of those monies. It lays out some prescribed purposes and eligible activities for that funding, and it also creates the Gulf Coast Restoration Council and tasks them to develop a comprehensive plan for regional restoration efforts. The Act also directs the U.S. Treasury to develop oversight requirements within 180 days, and so, it establishes some federal oversight even though there's no direct federal control. The Restore Act defines some allocation formulas, which we'll touch on in a moment, and it names a few other restrictions. For instance, the activities funded by the Restore Act may not be included in any claim for compensation paid out by the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund after the day of enactment, so no double dipping. It's important to note that as it's currently laid out, there are no time constraints on these expenditures, and that the Restore Act applies only to the impacts from the Deepwater Horizon incident. So as I said, the Restore Act defines 3 main funding mechanisms to distribute the civil penalty fines to the affected areas. 35% of the trust funds will go to the states in equal shares for local recovery, specified to be used for ecological and economic restoration of the Gulf Coast. States can only use the funds for specific purposes. Each state will be required to develop a science-based implementation plan that will describe how the projects are selected and how they meet the goals of the Restore Act. And for context, if you want to talk about money, if the civil penalties amount to $20 billion, for instance, each of the 5 states will get $1.12 billion. And there are some special allocations for Florida's 7% slice. The Restore Act directs that 75% of Florida's slice will go to the 8 disproportionately affected coastal counties, those 8 up in the northwest panhandle area, and the remaining 25% will go to the 15 non-disproportionately affected coastal counties, which follows south along the coastline. In December of last year, a committee of the 8 disproportionately affected counties met and agreed on an allocation formula amongst themselves to distribute the 75%, and they drafted a resolution to be approved by each of their county commissions just to further subdivide the money pool. Moreover, the Restore Act provides a framework for the eligible use of funds for the equal share allocation, and Lee will touch on that later on in the discussion. I want to note that the promotion of tourism is included in the list of eligible activities under the state allocation. The Florida DEP is expected to be the lead agency for the environmental projects, and the Florida Department for Economic Opportunity is expected to be the lead agency for the economic incentives and diversification. I also want to note that the state may give preference to local hiring. Next, we turn to the 30% of the civil penalty funds that are slated for the Restoration Council for local and interstate recovery. The Restore Act creates a Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council, which is comprised of federal officials plus the governors of each of the 5 Gulf Coast states. The Council is tasked to develop and implement a science-based comprehensive plan for the entire Gulf Coast region for projects to restore and protect natural resources. So in money terms, if the BP civil penalties amount to $20 billion, then the Restoration Council will get $4.8 billion. The Restore Act also lays out some rules about public transparency and reporting, so there will be an annual report to the Congress. The Act also establishes some timelines for the comprehensive plan, which is currently being drafted, with the initial plan being due out sometime in early 2013. The Gulf Coast Council must also develop standard contract terms, which will give some preference to local Gulf Coast state individuals and companies. Next, we come to the 30% of funds that are slated for the impact-based state allocations. These funds will be allocated to the states according to how severely each state was impacted by the oil spill. And this involves the use of an intricate formula-based calculation to determine the impacts of the BP spill on each state. In order to receive those funds, the states must develop a funding plan that lists the projects that will receive the grants, and those plans must also be consistent with the Council's comprehensive plans and regional goals and objectives. So the state plans may include both environmental and economic recovery projects. And again, in money terms, if the civil penalties amount to $20 billion, then the impact-based state allocation would amount to $4.8 billion. And specifically to Florida, the Act further stipulates how the funds will be used, and it creates the Gulf Coast Consortium, which is comprised of at least one representative from each of the 23 affected Florida coastal counties. Because the coastal zone of Florida includes so much of the state, they considered it necessary to specify a county-by-county allocation in Florida. And again, with the 75 versus 25% split between the 8 disproportionately affected panhandle counties and the other 15 coastal counties. And with another complicated formula, it determines the exact funding amount by each county. It's interesting to note that unlike the other 2 portions of money, the impact-based state allocations does not have a specified local hire provision at this point. So to recap, the Restore Act provides the framework for 3 main funding mechanisms to the Gulf Coast area, with some nuances separating them, but the details for implementation for all 3 are still evolving. It is important to understand these changing details to give your local projects the best chance for success. This is a great opportunity to do some real good in our communities, and the best part really is that the public does have a say. So looking ahead, there are things to watch for. The U.S. Department of Treasury is currently drafting procedures for administering the Restore Act funds, and this should be released soon. There will be a public comment period. And because it's likely to be a lot of money to keep track of, it's clearly going to be important to understand how the money will flow from the Treasury to the trust and then to the states and local governments. The Treasury will also be specifying the level of accountability and record-keeping for everybody. The estimates that we're hearing right now on the civil penalties are expected to be anywhere between $4 and $20 billion. The Gulf Coast Council is currently drafting their regional comprehensive plan. The proposed comprehensive plan is expected in early 2013, and they had their first public council meeting, which was held on December 11th in Mobile, and ECT was represented there. Meanwhile, here in Florida, the Gulf Coast Consortium has been formed. Their second public meeting was held last Friday. ECT had a representative there. Many Florida counties and municipalities are creating their own Restore committees and are developing wish lists of projects to bring forward in the process, and they, too, are waiting for the Council's regional comprehensive plan. Recently in the news, in early January, you may have heard about the Transocean settlement. Transocean was a subcontractor to BP, and they agreed to a civil penalty settlement of $1 billion. And pursuant to the Restore Act, 80% of this amount is to be directed toward the Gulf Coast restoration-related activities. This is subject to a 21-day comment period and final court approval. And relevant both to Restore and to the NRDA process, it's important to understand that all of the trust fund awards are currently pending the BP civil penalty settlements. So all of this, is pending what they decide the money will be. The funds are expected to be divided somehow between NRDA and Restore, and however that split falls will determine exactly how much money will come through to the local restoration projects. This is going to affect all of us. The BP civil hearing is scheduled to start on February 25th, and we need to be paying close attention to see how the Department of Justice handles the split of civil penalties between the two acts. And this brings us to our next speaker, Lee Smith, who will talk about identifying project opportunities. Lee?
Thanks, Jude. My name is Lee Smith. I'm an ECT Water Resources Engineer and Project Manager, and I'm currently working with some coastal communities in Northwest Florida to develop projects that they would like to see eventually funded with some Restore Act money. A common theme that we encounter in talking with these folks in coastal communities is that although there aren't a lot of details yet with respect to exactly how the Restore Act funds are going to be dispersed, they are sensing some urgency to do what they can now to make sure that they're ready and they don't miss out once the details are filled in and the money starts to move. So along those lines, what I'm going to talk about today are some steps that communities and stakeholder groups can take now to identify and prioritize projects that may qualify for funding under the Restore Act. Next, please. So bringing this down to the local level, and what should you be doing now as a community leader or as a member of such a stakeholder group? Well, first of all, you, your group, your city or county staff, local organization need to have at least one or preferably a few people who are actively following developments as the Restore Act process moves ahead. And keep in mind, as I think was pretty well spelled out already, that there are a lot of details remaining to be filled in. And there are different requirements that are going to apply to the different funding streams. And even within Restore Act, there will be a need to keep track of the moving parts. At the end of our talk, we're going to show you some resources we think will help you to do that. But beyond that, there's some general principles built into the language of the Act and just general good practice for developing successful projects that you can be using to help guide you in your planning. Next, please. A quick summary of some of the important ground rules to be aware of. If you've ever been involved in in the process of putting together project funding, you know that meeting match requirements for grant funding can be often one of the biggest challenges. And some good news here is that the Restore Act language concerning the 35% that goes direct to the states, the Pot 1 money, is expressly allowed to be used to satisfy federal grant match requirements. Secondly, in order to use trust fund money, your project or program has to fall within coastal zones, and there is a legal definition for that. You can ask your city or county attorney about it. But it's more or less what it sounds like. Or 25 miles inland from coastal zones. Essentially, it's coastal waters and adjacent shorelands. This would accommodate, for example, taking a watershed-based look at water quality projects, projects that affect ecosystems holistically, so you're dealing with things like point source and non-point source issues at the same time. Most local planning at this point seems to be focused on Pot 1, which is the 35% state allocations. But it may make sense to look at other pots of money for even at the local level for certain kinds of projects that may be able to be tied into a larger scale effort. which is really more the focus of pots 2 and 3. To be eligible for funding through the council, projects do have to be listed in the State Comprehensive Restoration Plan. It's expected that competition for this particular pot of money will be very aggressive, and priority, as is one of the few things that is spelled out clearly in the Restore Act, priority will be given to projects that have certain features, either projects or programs that make the greatest contribution to restoring and protecting natural resources and ecosystems and fisheries and so on, large-scale projects and programs, think in terms of regional cooperation, projects that are already in existing state comprehensive restoration plans, and projects that restore long-term resiliency of natural resources, ecosystems, and so on. And then finally, the oil spill allocation revenue stream is reserved for counties that experienced oiled shorelines. Next, please. Specifically concerning Pot 1, then, because that's the one that most local communities are spending the most time thinking about these days. A project or program that's proposed for funding using this state allocation money will also need to satisfy these items. It has to be designed to restore and protect natural resources and so on. Needs to carry out one or more eligible activities, and we'll talk about a few of those shortly. And also, there needs to be a meaningful public input process. The eligible activities. Let's see. Next, please. Are really pretty broad. There are a whole lot of different things that could be fit into this category. Just to give you an idea of the possibilities, for instance, a community that wants to revitalize its waterfront in order to promote tourism or its seafood industry might want to look at some ways to include some project features such as water quality improvements by way of low-impact development stormwater BMPs. We see a lot of waterfront areas that are highly impervious areas, very little stormwater management. It may be a good opportunity to address that and do some water quality improvements that would also provide some nice aesthetics for the waterfront. Interpretive signage is a good thing to think about, possibly a marine science exhibit, something along those lines, and that's just one example. Next, please. Every community has got a wish list, a universe of potential project ideas and opportunities that are available to them. Feasibility, viability is another matter. There are certain areas we recommend that you look at specifically, and in evaluating your wish list projects. For one thing, the funding criteria that applies, and not just Restore Act, but we're also, as we're talking with communities, we're looking at some other sources that are out there that could potentially be leveraged at the same time. But for the sources of money that are available, does the project meet the funding criteria, or can it be made to better fit the funding criteria? Additionally, how's the community support? Is something that's backed up. I mean, this has to be developed with public input, so you need to obviously have good community support for it. And then finally, as a general matter, the closer a project is to being ready to build, the more likely it is to be funded. So just some general principles to keep in mind there. And what we're looking for in particular is projects that are on that wish list that fit into kind of the intersect of these three lenses. And those are going to be probably your highest value projects. And if you have something that's very important to the community and it doesn't fit that intersect, something good you can be doing right now is look at ways to adapt the project concept and make it fit. The things that we're doing as we're working through this process with local communities, we find that some good opportunities emerge, some ways to maybe add some more eligible activities, some additional sources of funding that can be brought into play, and potentially some project partners that would have be able to bring more value to the project, and they may have a project that you can bring more value to. Some common challenges that come up, having to do with the issue of shovel readiness. Have you accomplished what's needed in the way of planning, design, and permitting? And this right now is we're sort of waiting for details to be filled in. If you know you've got a high-value project, this might be a good time to be putting some effort into that realm. In many cases, you'll have a good project that has a geographical footprint that crosses over into another jurisdiction, and so it's a good time to be talking with the various folks who would be involved in basically helping move a project like that forward, and make sure that that you develop the best consensus you can. And then there are some physical site issues sometimes, or legal site issues that have to do with land acquisition. You may have a good project that requires either some easements or some land acquisition in order to move it forward, and say this is a good time to be looking at those things and see if you can get those unlocked to keep them from becoming hindrances down the road. And then basically, when you've got your stakeholder group, you've got your active folks together, this is a good time to be sort of looking at these things, and when you see what needs to be done, go ahead and get some folks to take some action items and run with them. Marty Bootenow is going to talk about what this could look like in a given potential project. Marty?
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marty. I'm a certified ecologist with ECT, and I've spent the better part of my career helping communities and various stakeholders conceptualize and move projects forward to funding and successful implementation. And I want to share with you this afternoon some of the experiences I've had and some things that have worked very well for stakeholders and communities over the years in my experience. And the next slide, we'll see that restoration projects are multiple-step projects. They start with comprehensive and strategic planning, move through community outreach, engineering and design, permitting and funding, and ultimately successful construction and post-construction monitoring. However, as you can see here, it all starts with good comprehensive and strategic planning. You must start and build a good solid foundation on which to move your project forward. And those are some of the kind of things I want to highlight for you this afternoon. On the next slide, we see that demonstrating good planning and that good foundation involves several things that typically work very well. First of all, comprehensive and integrated planning. That means that your project is based on planning that has looked at the big picture. All the comprehensive potential components of the project have been looked at, and various aspects of the project have been looked at, from funding, permitting, infrastructure requirements, limitations, constraints on the project, all various different aspects of the project. And by integrated, we mean that we take various aspects and components of the environment, including the human and built environment, and integrate those in together into proper planning so that they all work together in a synergistic manner. Good community involvement is always very important, bringing the community along in the process. Building ownership, building values with the community is important. And along the way, making sure that your funding partners and regulatory agency folks are involved in the process as well, too. It's never too early to start conversations and just starting to bounce ideas and concepts around with some of these folks involved in both funding and in the regulatory agencies as well, too. One of the things that funding reviews often look at is the regulatory constraints potentially placed upon a project. Some of those hurdles can be addressed early in the planning process by talking to the right regulatory agency people. And then lastly, making sure that your project is based upon good science-based approaches, proven techniques, and proving approaches to restoring the environment that have worked in the past. Now let's look at a project here, a hypothetical project in the next slide that kind of demonstrates some of these ideas in terms of comprehensive planning and integration of different aspects of a site. Here we have a fairly typical Florida coastline that includes a saltwater marsh extending up into the landscape. And this particular site was formerly slated for a development project, a housing project, and you can see some of the infrastructure development that had already occurred. However, due to the housing market collapse, the builder went bankrupt, the land reverted back to public ownership or into public ownership. And now there's this opportunity to restore the site potentially. What is your community going to do with this project, and could it potentially fit into the Restore Act, for example? Now, this may have come into public ownership prior to the Restore Act, but that doesn't exclude the opportunity potentially of actually purchasing or acquiring property as part of the restoration process as well, too. However, for this site, in the next slide, we'll see that we have the saltwater marsh extending into the landscape that was formerly impacted, and the opportunity now, because it's in public ownership or the community has the opportunity to purchase it, we can do some things to restore this marsh. There may be hydrological impacts, invasive species impacts, there could be hydrological barriers that have placed in this saltwater marsh, and we can remove those former impacts to improve the overall health and quality of this particular resource. However, looking at it on a big picture scale, we have a large piece of property, and we may have a lot of other, or we have other typical opportunities that we can incorporate it into here. For example, adding in conservation buffers is extremely important. In the next slide, we'll see, because the saltwater marsh itself may be impacted by encroachments and activities encroaching upon it. Because we have the land area available, we can establish this land conservation buffer, and within that we can do various types of habitat improvement projects as well too, to remove historical impacts, remove invasive species, and improve the overall quality of the buffer itself. This improves the overall sustainability and long-term sustainability of the saltwater marsh itself. And in the next slide, we'll see that there's off-site impacts that aren't incorporated into this. And the next slide also shows that we have water coming in from to the north and some development off to the left as well too. And even though these sources of hydrology are off-site and outside of our control, they are extremely important to the overall ecosystem surrounding the saltwater marsh. That freshwater hydrology is a vital component. However, because of the various activities occurring off-site, there may be impacts coming on-site in terms of stormwater pollution, nutrients, sediments that are being delivered into the system. So at this location, at the north end, we can put some type of stormwater treatment wetland controls in place that will capture that water, treat it, and then deliver it into the site where it's needed for the freshwater supply to the entire ecosystem. And then the next slide, we move down to the coastal area, and we can see some potential opportunities then off the shoreline here, around the shoreline. First and foremost, we may have direct shoreline impacts from oil that have previous oiling of habitats, previous oiling of beaches, previous oiling of vegetation, et cetera, that may have to get cleaned up. And then also there may be some long-term losses to habitat or impacts to habitat along the coast that could potentially be restored. And then also sticking to the coast, in the next slide we'll see that there could be potential for oyster reef rehabilitation or creation or restoration. This is a huge issue along the Florida coast, and the state has been working with partners for years now in trying to reestablish oyster reefs. We have great habitat here to do this, but some historical impacts that could be addressed through oyster reef creation and or restoration. And also, seagrass communities in many coastal Florida areas have been impacted. In the next slide, you can see that we have an opportunity here then, off the mouth of the saltwater marsh, to reestablish seagrass beds. And again, the state of Florida has been working with partners to do this, both growing materials, finding places to install them and monitor them, and restoring seagrass communities in this particular location would have great benefits to the Gulf of Mexico fisheries. And then in the next slide, you'll see that we have all this infrastructure, we have roads in place, and those have impacted the natural environment. So we can take some of those out. However, because the impact's there, it also offers the opportunity to install a trail system, to bring the public into the site and let them experience the outdoor environment and the wonderful quality resources that are present here within your community. Now, one of the roads crosses the marsh, so in the next slide we'll see that that road is causing some hydrological problems and delivering fresh water upstream to downstream into the marsh. And it's also causing a backup of water, which is causing encroachment of invasive species and flooding of the marsh upstream as well too, which changes the plant community. So that road crossing can be taken out, those hydrological barriers can be taken out, but at the same time, through that impacted corridor, we can incorporate a more sensitive environmental trail to allow people to cross the marsh system as well too. And in the next slide then, because we have this opportunity to bring people into the site, not only restore it, but allow people to come in and experience it within your community, we can offer the opportunity for this interpretive center and a kayak launch that allows people to actually get on the water and use the resource for passive recreation, fishing, et cetera, at the same time. Now, on the next slide, we can see how that all comes together in one big, huge, comprehensive integrated plan that incorporates all these various aspects. Now, this is a much different project than just the saltwater marsh protection and restoration project. And you can see that it offers a lot more to the community, a lot more to the resource, and all that value is going to improve the chances of your project getting into either the comprehensive restoration plan or on restoration plan lists for the county consortium. And we'll move to that idea of advocating for your project next. In the next slide, you'll see that we have several different things that you can do that have worked very well in our experience with stakeholders and communities for advocating for your projects. We don't know exactly how that's going to happen yet, but one way or another, you will get the opportunity to advocate for one of your projects in your community or all the projects in your community that you'd like to see funded, either through the restoration, comprehensive restoration plan or the county consortium. We've already talked about demonstrating good planning, but in your funding request to these various organizations, it's going to be important that you demonstrate that planning process that you've got in place already and improved upon perhaps as well too from information you've gained along the way. Present your case creatively and effectively. Funding request is not just an opportunity to present a project. It's an opportunity to tell in a creative manner why this project should be funded, why it has value, and what it can offer. And in that same context, that means telling your story very well. It's not just a dry, bland presentation of what you're going to do and why and how, but it's giving your community personality, showing how your community came to conceptualization of this project, wants to, and why you want to fund it, why you want to implement it, what values your community holds in the resource, what values your community places in the resources. Those are all important things for these organizations to know about your community. Be creative in thinking solutions to problems and needs as well too. For example, you may have stormwater management needs in your community. Most communities do. How do you manage that? Is there an opportunity for taking stormwater infrastructure project that has funding from other sources and turning it into more of a green infrastructure project and incorporating some type of restoration or environmental protection component to it? Be creative in thinking about those. If you have, for example, a bridge that has to be replaced in your community over a tributary or a marsh like we have here, how can that bridge be redesigned and replaced in a way that incorporates ecological restoration and environmental protection in the long run? With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jim and let him wrap things up for us this afternoon.
Well, I promised you guys a lot of information, and I think we delivered. Let me begin by saying I started talking about ECT's experience with past restoration projects. And if what we've learned in the past is true in this, there's a better than even chance that there will be competition between different federal governments for money, competition between the states for money, competition between the counties for money, and then competitions at the local units of government. But in spite of all that, good projects win. Projects that meet the goals set forth, in this case, the Restore Act, well-planned projects, much of what Marty was running through, and then shovel-ready projects. Having a good idea is different than having a set of plans, a construction estimate, and being able to tell the funding agency, we can start construction next week. That's a winning project. Next slide. You've heard a lot in the newspapers, you've heard politicians speak, and that's all really part of trying to make sure that this money is released and is available. The simple part that you've seen in the newspaper and probably read over, but Jude pointed out, is the discussion between funds going to NRDA versus the Restore Act are big for you. Restore Act, the locals make the decision. The NRDA money, the feds make the decision. So it's important that we continue to keep pressure on to keep the money coming through the Restore Act. The reason we set up these websites is to try to get the available information out in as many formats as we can. We want our clients to be prepared and ready to move when the money begins to flow. So if you prefer just checking out a website once in a while, feel free to go to the Restore Act info Or if you like us on Restore Act Info on the Facebook page, in your Facebook will come all kinds of interesting articles on the Restore Act. Similarly, you can follow us on Twitter, or if you're real old school and want emails to pop up into your inbox, feel free to request information on info@restoreactinfo.com. Next. But we're talking about $1 billion at least, many billions of dollars. These are giant numbers. This is a really exciting opportunity for a beautiful part of the world. And the fact that you're listening to this webinar suggests you know it's a great opportunity and you're trying to position your community to succeed in getting some of those funds. So what's ECT going to do? Well, we'll continue to interact with Congress and the feds. We know that we speak much more effectively when we are speaking for local communities. And so we will continue to work with our community clients and try to make sure that their voice is being heard. And we will interact with the state. We're going to advocate for the local communities and monitor the rules, because that's how much of the money is going to flow to these communities. And we'll continue to interact with the community. We want to be able to identify good projects, tee those projects up, and help them secure the funding. Next slide. So, my suggestion to you, give Lee a call, give any of us a call anyone at ECT. We'll direct you to the experts that can best help you on your project, your specific project. We've spent a lot of time collecting a lot of information. We'd love to share that information with you. Don't be afraid to ask.